I remember always having conversations for the last 10 years about what is my thought process about Black Lives Matter. Such as so, I even remember for the last 3 years having panels and discussions about Black Lives Matter, my uncensored view about Black Lives Matter. But that being said, it's always been these mixed arrays of emotions and conversations and opinions, not only from myself, but people around me or people I knew I had a conversation with, especially when it came to the year of 2019, I believe, when different projects was taken shape across different American cities where they had featured putting Black Lives Matter being painted on city streets. And still to this day, certain places still display it. But, if you look at certain cities, it's basically just been driven over so many times. The paint started to chip. So you can't see Black Lives Matter anymore. Now, I've said this from very much day one. Black Lives Matter is not an organization that cares about the so-called Black man. The so-called Black man is used as a sacrifice for Black Lives Matter. Why do I say that? Because anytime you talk about Black Lives Matter, it only matters when a Black man dies. There's never any celebration of so-called Black businesses, especially if a Black man dares to start one. Not even touching upon the fact matter, there are so-called Black men that are millionaires and billionaires in this country. But of course, it's all about Black Lives Matter, which situates itself in the Communist Manifesto and also trying to entangle themselves putting themselves within a lot of liberal groups, namely the LGBTQ community. I've said this time and time again. And the thing about it is that you've seen so many displays of Black Lives Matter pretty much shooting itself in the foot, such as so a lot of nepotism going on. And then also just these purchases that's happening with the money, especially with a lot of these monies not really being given to Black-owned organizations or organizations that's caring for Black people, but instead a lot of organizations that's given namely to the LGBTQ community, especially of uplifting trans. Now, with that being said, it's also the fact of the matter that besides it being for that, it's also projecting itself to pay homage to the Baphomet. Anybody who understands exactly what the Baphomet is supposed to inherit or supposed to be said is that obviously it's the figure of the goat head with the breast and the penis or the phallus, as above, so below. And the thing about it is, you can see exactly how it plays out if they dare to put it in that type of perspective. Well, they're never going to talk about it, but they're always going to make it upon that for that very reason. And I'm talking spiritually. Now, of course, with that being said, it has been brought to my attention, not only because Juneteenth just passed, but also how amazing and how funny I find it that the support for the movement itself has dropped in numbers. Now, I'm going to go over this article with you, and we're going to talk about it. It says right here, due to Pew survey shows support for Black Lives Matter movement drops to new low. Most say increased focus on race hasn't improved Black lives. Now, those that's been watching on YouTube for a second, besides my channel, there's been very much a lot of these YouTube videos and a lot of these documentaries that's basically taught the fact that Black Lives Matter has showed a massive amount of degeneracy instead of actual progress for Black people. Namely, so when you see in a lot of these movements happen, when famously a so-called Black man would die, and the next thing you know, they're protesting on the streets, and the modern day so-called Black woman uses that as an argument against the so-called Black man and say, we support you, but support isn't supposed to be twerking in front of the White House or twerking me seeing your pink panties in front of cops when you're making a statement. Also, so-called Black men, namely getting in their fifis every single time they come along a police officer, and Tifa having their whole entire thing of being involved in some type of degenerate behavior when it comes to Black Lives Matter, everything being supposed to be about LGBT. It never made any sense to me. And the thing about it is, so many people will sit up there and call you the C word, all because you didn't believe in the vision of Black Lives Matter. Rightfully so, I've said incessantly on this channel since day one, Black Lives Matter should not be an organization that the so-called Black man should support. And I stand by that as I continue on this YouTube journey, and as should anybody else. Now, this is not me coming from a political angle. It's just because the things that's been happening in history with the chapters and all these different things do not add up. But let me continue reading this article. Support for the Black Lives Matter movement fell to a new low in polling released Wednesday, with most respondents saying an increased focus on race since 2020 hasn't improved Black lives. Among adults responding to the latest Pew Research Center survey, 51% said they support BLM, down from 56% in a March 2022 poll, and the high watermark of 67% recorded in June 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in police custody. Another 46% said they oppose BLM, a new high. That's the lowest level of support the nonprofit research center has recorded since it started polling the issue in August 2017. Pew recorded the previous low of support for BLM, 55%, 3 times in its August 2017, September 2020, and September 2021 polls. A majority of Americans say the increased focus on issues of race and racial inequality in the past 3 years hasn't led to changes that have improved the lives of Black people. Pew researchers Juliana Minnesett, Horowitz, Kylie Hurst, and Donna Braga wrote in a summary of the findings. The hashtag Black Lives Matter hashtag first appeared on Twitter 10 years ago, Pew noted. Now, with that being said, obviously, one of the things that recently happened, in which I feel like is a delightful troll mission that happened from this political commentator, they actually came forward and gave their thought process about Juneteenth and then related that conversation to Black Lives Matter and how so-called Black people cry a lot when it comes to racism. Now, my thing about it is this: do so-called Black people experience racism in America? Absolutely. They do, without a shadow of a doubt, especially the so-called Black man who is low on a totem pole among anything else, at rock bottom. Now, the thing about it is, a so-called Black woman will take that time to berate the so-called Black man about how he needs to step up and be better and all these different things, not understanding there is a lot of chips that's set against the so-called Black man, as well as the so-called Black woman, but the so-called Black woman gets a little bit of better treatment than the so-called Black man. Now, with that being said, obviously we know the political commentator Candace Owens, who's been making it her mission to pretty much troll and defame the Black Lives Matter, in which I humbly agree with on very much a lot of aspects. But Candace Owens coming out with the documentary and finally pulling up the records of the tax returns that they had got in one of the years in which they had basically noted what they made purchases on from their organization. So funny thing about that is when you check it out, Candace Owens made the Juneteenth post, in which I had very much not really a lot of opinions on it, but I found it interesting, in which it says on this post, Candace Owens accuses Black people of crying racism over Juneteenth posts, which we'll just go over the story. Conservative commentator Candace Owens on Tuesday doubled down on her opposition to Juneteenth, accusing Black people who criticized her previous posts mocking the holiday of crying racism. Owens, a Black woman herself and an outspoken conservative political pundit, generated controversy on Monday, Juneteenth, with a tweet denigrating the newest federal holiday as so ghetto. Juneteenth is still ghetto and made up. Hope everyone enjoys it. The tweet generated considerable negative pushback, with numerous users on Twitter responding to Owens' initial post with their own, explaining the history of the holiday and what it means to them and their communities. Celebrated annually on Juneteenth, Juneteenth commemorates the complete end of slavery in the U.S. The date marks the anniversary of Union General Gordon Granger proclaiming the abolition of slavery in Texas on June 19, 1865. Texas was the final state in which President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation from 1863 was enforced. Granger's proclamation was made a few weeks after the American Civil War ended in Galveston, the city where the celebration of Juneteenth originates. First observed among Black communities in Texas, over the decades, Juneteenth was gradually embraced by communities across the country, building up a border cultural footprint until it was declared a federal holiday by President Joe Biden in 2021, in which I still believe to this day Joe Biden is a racist, even though a lot of people may disagree, but he is definitely a racist. I think he did it because he wanted to gain political points with so-called Black people. That's just my opinion. It is the most recently established federal holiday following Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which was officially adopted in 1983. Now, I just want you guys to pay attention to it. I'm not going to go over this last paragraph, but as you can see in the Twitter post, it says right here, last week on my podcast, I covered Lance Bass, Megan Fox, Vivek Rashamari, Dave Rubin, Prince Harry, Conor McGregor, and Andrew Tate. But my Juneteenth. Generally speaking, Black people today are emotional, silly putty, and cannot take any criticism without crying racism. And you know something? Understanding the personality of someone like Candace Owens, you know, especially one that does the whole entire pro-Black ploy all the time and stuff like that, but being married to a so-called white man, it just fascinates me to see her go on record and go on TV and talk all the time. But at the same time, does she have a point about sitting up there saying that so-called Black people cry about racism? There is, and then there isn't. There is appropriate situations where so-called Black people rightfully so should cry about racism, and then there's other times when they shouldn't. But especially when I see older so-called Black men attend these stupid ass rallies that's governed by Black Lives Matter and thinking by screaming at a cop it's going to do something, it doesn't mean anything. Now, the point is of this channel that I make towards so-called Black men in particular, we must take it upon ourselves to move forward in this society without complaints, taking responsibility for our actions, making sure we're doing the right thing, and making sure we're moving forward as men if we want to be looked at as kings. Can't get nowhere as a so-called Black man if you think by screaming at a cop or yelling about these unjust systems in America is going to change something. It's really not. But anyway, that's just my thought process on it. Give me your thoughts in the comment section. Like, share, subscribe. Peace.